The business card felt like a death certificate in my wallet. 8 years of marriage reduced to a name, phone number, and the words family law attorney embossed in elegant serif font. I'd been carrying it for 3 weeks, transferring it from my wallet to my pocket, to desk drawer and back again. Never quite able to make the call, but never quite able to throw it away either. My name is Joel McKenney, 37 years old, and I was about to become another statistic. I could pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted, though I'd never be able to explain it to anyone's satisfaction. It wasn't a single fight or betrayal. It was more like watching someone you love slowly transform into a stranger living in your house. We had stopped touching. Then we stopped talking. Then we'd started keeping score of every late night at work, every dinner eaten in silence, and every conversation that never happened. Carrie had stopped trying around the time I accepted the federal consulting contract. She'd wanted me to turn it down. Wanted me to stay at my smaller firm where weekends were actually mine. I'd taken it anyway. Career ambition, I told myself, was about building our future. She'd said nothing in response, but I'd felt the withdrawal like a physical thing, a door closing somewhere deep inside her that I didn't know how to reopen. For the past 4 years, we'd been living parallel lives in our Georgetown townhouse. She'd go to bed by 10. I'd work until 1 in the morning. She'd be up and gone before I woke. The guest room had become her bedroom somewhere along the way, though we'd never explicitly discussed it. It had just happened, like so many things had just happened without actual words being exchanged between us. 2 months ago, I'd finally said it out loud. I think we need to consider whether this is working anymore. I'd expected her to cry, to argue, to fight for us. Instead, she'd simply said, "We should probably talk about that." That phrase, delivered so quietly, so absolutely without emotion, had broken something in me I hadn't realized was still whole. But we never did talk about it. The word sat between us for weeks, growing heavier, until I'd finally reached out to the colleague who'd given me the attorney's card. I was still staring at the business card when my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. The vibration startled me out of the thought spiral I'd been trapped in for the past 20 minutes. The kind of circular thinking that went nowhere but somehow consumed all available mental energy. I glanced at the screen. A text from Carrie. "Don't forget Valerie's brunch today. 11 o'clock in DuPont. Please be ready by 10:30 so we're not late." Valerie Sullivan's brunch. I'd completely forgotten, which wasn't surprising given that my brain had been occupied with a much heavier task of contemplating the dissolution of my marriage. Valerie was Carrie's college roommate, one of those women who seemed to glide through life with enviable ease, hosting gatherings in her renovated row house like it required no effort at all. The kind of person who probably had a Pinterest board for casual Sunday entertaining, and actually used it. The last thing I wanted was to spend a Sunday morning making small talk with people I barely knew, balancing mimosas and tiny quiches while pretending Carrie and I were still the couple everyone thought we were. We become experts at the performance over the past few years, skilled actors in a 2-person play that no one had bothered to write an ending for. We could do polite. We could do functional. We could even do convincingly content if the situation required it. But God, I was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of measuring every word before I spoke it. I was tired of existing in the same physical space as someone I used to know better than myself and now couldn't read at all. The thought of spending 3 hours performing normalcy felt like being asked to run a marathon after already running one the day before. I typed out a response. "Do we have to go?" The 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared. Then appeared again. When her response finally came through, it was shorter than I expected. I already told Valerie we'd be there. There was no emotion in the text, no plea or frustration or anything that might give me insight into what she was actually thinking. Just a statement of fact. We were expected. Therefore we would go. It was the kind of exchange that had become standard between us. Information transmitted with maximum efficiency and minimum vulnerability. I could push back. I could tell her I wasn't feeling well, that work had piled up, that I needed to stay home and deal with things. She wouldn't argue. She'd go without me, make some excuse to Valerie about a last-minute emergency, and no one would think twice about it. Couples had conflicts. People understood. But something stopped me. Maybe it was guilt, the low-grade, persistent kind that had become background noise in my daily life. Maybe it was the memory of better times when we actually enjoyed these gatherings together, when Carrie would lean into me during conversations and I'd catch her eye across a crowded room and know exactly what she was thinking. Maybe it was just the exhausted recognition that refusing would require more emotional energy than simply agreeing. Or maybe, buried somewhere beneath all the resignation and weariness, I still didn't want to disappoint her. Okay. I'll be ready. Her response came back instantly. Thank you. 2 words. Polite, appreciative, and completely devoid of warmth. I set the phone down and looked at the business card again. Patricia Moretti, Esquire. Family law attorney. The embossed letters seemed to mock me, a reminder that I was carrying around the means to end this, but couldn't quite force myself to use it. I picked up the card, felt its weight between my fingers, then deliberately placed it face down in my desk drawer and pushed it closed. Not thrown away. Not acted upon. Just postponed. A temporary reprieve. Maybe the brunch would give me clarity. Maybe spending a morning watching Carrie interact with other people would remind me of all the reasons this wasn't working, would steel my resolve to finally make the call I'd been avoiding. Or maybe it would just be another few hours of going through the motions, adding to the mountain of evidence that we'd become experts at existing side by side without actually connecting. I stood up from my desk, my coffee long since gone cold. I had 90 minutes to shower, get dressed, and prepare myself to be the version of Joel McKinney that other people expected to see. The successful government consultant. The devoted husband. The man who had his life together. The performance was about to begin. Valerie Sullivan's row house was exactly the kind of place you'd expect from someone who'd made a career in interior design. Exposed brick walls softened by carefully curated art pieces, restored hardwood floors that gleamed in the late morning light, and furniture that managed to look both expensive and inviting. The kind of space that appeared in lifestyle magazines with captions about effortless elegance that actually required meticulous planning and significant financial investment. Valerie answered the door in linen pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her smile warm and genuine as she pulled Carrie into an embrace. I stood slightly behind, holding the bottle of wine we'd picked up on the way over, a safe mid-range selection that said we'd made an effort without trying too hard. Joel. So good to see you, Valerie said, air-kissing both my cheeks in that way certain DC women did, as if we were all constantly practicing for diplomatic receptions. Come in, come in. Everyone's already here. That's when I saw Carrie properly for the first time that morning. We'd gotten ready in different rooms, as had become our habit, and the drive over had been mostly silent except for her navigation prompts. But now, standing in Valerie's foyer with natural light streaming through the transom windows, I could actually see her. She was wearing the burgundy wrap dress. The one I'd always loved, the one that brought out the warmth in her dark skin and made her look both elegant and approachable. She'd let her hair fall in soft waves around her shoulders instead of the tight, professional bun she wore to her marketing firm every day. There was something different about her face, too, a lightness I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. She was smiling at something Valerie was saying, and it was the real smile. The one that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. The smile she saved for other people. I felt something twist in my chest, sharp and unexpected. When was the last time she'd smiled at me like that? When was the last time I'd given her a reason to? We moved through to the open living and dining area where the other guests had already congregated. Melody Foster and her husband Cameron stood near the windows, both of them lawyers who specialized in international trade law and seemed incapable of discussing anything else. Jada and Amir Hughes were examining Valerie's latest acquisition, some abstract painting that probably had a story involving a gallery opening and too much champagne. The Gauthiers, an older couple I'd met once or twice before, were seated on the velvet sofa with mimosas already in hand. 6 couples. 12 people performing the weekend ritual of sophisticated socializing. "Joel, you have to try these," Valerie said, pressing a small plate into my hands laden with what appeared to be smoked salmon on some kind of artisanal cracker. "The salmon is from that new place on Connecticut Avenue. Absolutely divine." I nodded, murmured something appropriately appreciative, and watched Carrie settle into conversation with Valerie and Melody near the kitchen island. Within seconds, they were laughing about something, their heads bent together in that conspiratorial way women had when sharing stories men weren't meant to hear. Carrie's entire body language had changed, relaxed, animated, present in a way she never was at home anymore. I found myself gravitating toward Amir, who at least had the decency to talk about something other than work. He was explaining their recent kitchen renovation, the nightmare of dealing with contractors, the triumph of finding vintage cabinet hardware. I made the appropriate noises, asked the expected questions, played my role in the conversation. "And how are things with you two?" Amir asked eventually, his tone casual but his eyes too knowing. "Feels like we haven't seen you both in months." This was the moment. The opening where honesty could slip through if I let it. I could tell him we were barely speaking, that we were living like polite roommates, that I had a divorce attorney's business card in my desk drawer. Instead, I smiled. "You know how it is. Work's been crazy. We've both been buried." "I hear that," he said, raising his glass in solidarity. "The grind never stops." Across the room, Carrie laughed at something Melody said, and the sound carried over the ambient noise of conversation and clinking glasses. It was bright and genuine and completely foreign to me. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard her laugh like that in our house. The brunch proceeded exactly as these things always did. Superficial conversations about local politics and whether the new Ethiopian restaurant in Shaw was worth the wait. Debates about summer vacation plans and whether the Outer Banks was becoming too crowded. Someone brought up the latest metro delays and everyone had an opinion about the Purple Line extension. Safe topics. Easy topics. The kind of discussions that required no vulnerability and left no mark. Carrie and I performed our roles with practiced ease. When someone asked us a direct question, we answered as a unit, our responses coordinated without needing to look at each other. Years of marriage had taught us the choreography. We knew when to laugh, when to nod, when to deflect attention back to someone else. We knew how to stand near each other without touching, how to reference shared experiences without emotion, how to project the image of a functional couple without actually being one. "You two are so lucky," Jada said at one point, gesturing between Carrie and me with her mimosa glass. 8 years and you still seem so solid." Carrie's smile didn't falter. "We've had our moments," she said lightly, "but we work at it." The lie sat between us like a third presence, invisible to everyone else but impossibly heavy to me. We didn't work at it. We'd stopped working at it years ago. We'd simply become very good at the performance. The mimosas had gone through me faster than I'd anticipated, or maybe it was just the need to escape the relentless pleasantness of it all. I excused myself from a conversation with Cameron about some obscure Supreme Court ruling, murmuring something about needing the restroom, and slipped away from the living area with the relief of someone coming up for air after being underwater too long. Valerie's hallway was mercifully quiet, insulated from the ambient noise of laughter and conversation by thick walls and careful architecture. The bathroom was at the far end, past the kitchen and what looked like a home office. My footsteps were muffled by an expensive runner that probably had its own insurance policy. I was halfway down the hall when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Low and intimate, the kind of tones women used when they didn't want to be overheard by the larger group. I recognized Carrie's voice immediately. 8 years of marriage had attuned me to its particular cadence and rhythm, even when I could no longer predict what she might say. I should have kept walking. The bathroom was only a few more steps away, and whatever conversation was happening in the kitchen wasn't meant for me. But something made me slow down, made my footsteps become more careful, more deliberate. Some instinct that sensed importance in the hushed quality of their voices. I paused just outside the kitchen doorway, positioning myself where I could hear but not be seen. Through the gap between the door and the frame, I could see them, Carrie, Valerie, and Melody Foster, clustered near the marble island with wine glasses in hand. Carrie's back was partially to me, her shoulders curved in a way that suggested vulnerability, openness. It was a posture I hadn't seen her adopt in our house in years. "I just don't know what to do anymore," Carrie was saying, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the acoustics of the kitchen. "It's like we're ghosts in the same house." My hand froze halfway to my pocket. I knew I should move, should announce my presence or simply continue to the bathroom and preserve whatever privacy this moment required. But I couldn't. My feet had rooted themselves to the expensive runner beneath them. "Have you told him how you feel?" Melody asked gently. Carrie laughed, but it was a sound without humor, brittle and tired. "How do you tell someone you've lost them when they're still standing right in front of you?" Valerie murmured something I couldn't quite catch, something sympathetic and soft. I leaned forward slightly, pressing closer to the doorframe, my heart doing something strange and arrhythmic in my chest. "The worst part is," Carrie continued, and her voice had taken on a quality I'd never heard before, raw and unguarded in a way that made my throat tighten, "I know it's not all his fault. I know I shut down too. I built walls because it hurt too much to keep reaching out to someone who was never there." There was a pause, and I could hear the clink of glass against marble as someone set down their wine. "But Carrie," Valerie said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone preparing to say something important, "do you still love him?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I'd stopped breathing. My entire existence had narrowed to this moment, to this hallway, to whatever Carrie was about to say. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting. "Joel," Carrie said, and my name in her mouth sounded different than it had in years, weighted with something I couldn't quite identify. "God, Valerie. He's—" She trailed off, and I heard her take a shaky breath. I pressed closer to the doorframe, desperate not to miss a single word. "He's the only man who ever made me feel like I could be completely myself," Carrie said finally, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Like I didn't have to perform or pretend or be anything other than exactly who I am. Was. Whatever." My hand found the wall beside me, needing something solid to anchor myself to. The hallway seemed to tilt slightly, the expensive runner beneath my feet suddenly unstable. "Then why?" Melody started, but Carrie cut her off. "Because somewhere along the way, we forgot how to talk to each other. We forgot how to fight for each other. And now I don't know if it's too late." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, the bathroom completely forgotten. Everything I believed about our marriage, about Carrie's feelings, about the inevitability of our ending, all of it was being rewritten in real time by words I was never supposed to hear. "Joel is a good man," Carrie said, and there was something fierce in her voice that cut through me like a blade. That's what makes this so hard. He's not some villain I can blame. He's just someone who got lost in building a career while I got lost in resenting him for it. I could hear Melody murmur something, words of comfort or agreement that I couldn't quite make out. My entire world had narrowed to the sound of Carrie's voice, to the crack in it that suggested she was close to tears. "You remember what he was like when we first met, Val," Carrie continued, and I could picture her turning toward Valerie, seeking understanding from someone who'd known her longest. He was this brilliant, driven consultant, but he was also present. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He'd leave work at work and come home and we'd cook together and talk about everything and nothing. I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before. There was a pause, and I heard the sound of wine being poured, glass against glass. "So what changed?" Valerie asked gently. "The federal contract," Carrie said immediately, and I could hear the bitterness creeping into her voice now. 4 years ago. It was supposed to be this incredible opportunity, and it was professionally. But suddenly there were late nights and weekend briefings and emergency calls at dinner. And I tried to be understanding, I really did. But every time he chose work over us, it felt like he was choosing something else over me. "Did you tell him that?" Melody asked. Carrie laughed, that same brittle sound from before. "How do you tell someone they're breaking your heart when they're doing it in the name of building your future? How do you compete with ambition without sounding selfish?" My throat felt impossibly tight. I'd never known. In 4 years, she'd never said any of this to me directly. "So instead I just started pulling away," Carrie continued, her voice dropping lower. "I told myself if he wanted to disappear into work, fine. I'd build my own life. But the thing about building walls to protect yourself is that eventually you're just alone behind them. And by the time I realized what I'd done, the distance between us felt impossible to cross." "It's not impossible," Valerie said firmly. "Not if you both want to try." "But that's the thing," Carrie said, and now she definitely sounded like she was crying. "I don't know if he wants to anymore. I see the way he looks at me now, or doesn't look at me. Like I'm just furniture in the house. Something that exists but doesn't matter." I pressed my hand harder against the wall, needing the physical pain to anchor myself against the emotional devastation of her words. "The separate bedrooms started because I couldn't take it anymore," Carrie continued. "Do you know how lonely it is to lie next to someone who's mentally already gone? To share a bed with someone who touches you like it's an obligation, who rolls away the second they think you're asleep. I'd rather be physically alone than feel that kind of emotional abandonment while someone's lying right next to me." "Oh, Carrie," Melody said softly. "And now I think I've ruined it completely," Carrie said, and her voice was thick with tears. "I think I've pushed away the only man who ever really understood me. The only person I've ever felt completely safe with. Because I was too angry and too proud to just tell him I was drowning while he was succeeding." There was a long silence, broken only by what sounded like Carrie trying to compose herself. "Have you thought about couples therapy?" Valerie asked. "Or just having an honest conversation with him?" "I tried to bring it up 2 months ago," Carrie said. "He said we should consider whether this was working anymore. And you know what I did? I just said we should probably talk about it. Like it was something we could schedule between meetings. And then neither of us brought it up again because we're both too scared to actually face what's happening." "What do you want to happen?" Melody asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, impossibly loud. "I want him back," Carrie said finally, so quietly I almost missed it. "I want the man who used to make me laugh until my stomach hurt. Who remembered how I took my coffee without asking. Who'd cancel plans if I'd had a bad day because he said nothing was more important than making sure I was okay? I want the marriage we had before ambition and pride got in the way. But I don't know if that's even possible anymore. I don't know if we've broken something that can't be fixed. I stood frozen in that hallway, my hands still pressed against the wall, unable to move or breathe or think beyond the single devastating realization that I'd gotten everything wrong. Everything. Carrie's coldness wasn't indifference. It was armor. Her withdrawal wasn't evidence she'd stopped loving me. It was proof that she had, and that watching me disappear had hurt too much to bear without protection. And I'd been so consumed with my own wounded pride, so convinced she'd simply fallen out of love, that I'd never once asked her what was really happening. I'd never fought for the truth. I just accepted the surface story and let it confirm my worst assumptions. The business card in my desk drawer suddenly felt like the most obscene thing I'd ever touched. I don't know how long I stood in that hallway. It could have been seconds or minutes or hours. Time had lost its normal progression, stretching and compressing around the weight of what I'd just heard. Eventually, I heard movement from the kitchen, chairs scraping, voices shifting back to lighter tones, the sound of women composing themselves and preparing to rejoin the larger group. I moved on instinct, my body operating on autopilot while my mind tried to process the earthquake that had just restructured my entire understanding of the past 4 years. I walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and stared at my reflection in Valerie's expensive mirror. The face looking back at me was the same one I'd seen that morning, but everything behind it had fundamentally changed. Carrie's coldness wasn't indifference. It was self-protection. Her silence wasn't evidence of lost love, but fear of being vulnerable with someone who seemed emotionally unavailable. The separate bedrooms weren't about falling out of love, but about the unbearable loneliness of lying next to someone who was mentally absent. Every assumption I'd made, every conclusion I'd drawn, every piece of evidence I'd collected to support my narrative that she'd simply stopped caring, all of it was wrong. Catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. I'd been so focused on my own hurt, my own interpretation of her withdrawal, that I'd never once considered there might be a different story happening on her side. I'd taken her silence as confirmation of my worst fears instead of recognizing it as a symptom of her own pain. I'd let my wounded pride convince me that the marriage was dead when in reality, we'd both just been too scared and too proud to fight for it. The water I splashed on my face felt cold and clarifying, but it did nothing to settle the chaos in my chest. I dried my hands on a monogram towel that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill and tried to arrange my face into something that wouldn't immediately broadcast that my entire world had just been dismantled and rebuilt in the span of 5 minutes. When I returned to the living room, Carrie was already back, laughing at something Jada was saying. But I could see it now, the performance. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way her shoulders held a tension that hadn't been there in the kitchen when she'd been speaking honestly to her friends. She was doing exactly what I'd been doing all morning, playing the role, going through the motions, pretending everything was fine. We were both actors in a play neither of us wanted to be in anymore. I couldn't stay. Not with this knowledge burning through me like acid, rewriting every interaction we'd had for the past 4 years. Not while watching her perform normalcy when I now knew the depth of pain she'd been carrying. Not while the business card sat in my desk drawer at home like a loaded gun I'd been seconds away from using. I waited for a break in the conversation, then touched Valerie's arm gently. "I'm so sorry, but I need to head out. I just remembered I have a briefing document I need to review before tomorrow morning." The lie came both easily and smoothly, because I'd become an expert at them over the years. Valerie's face fell with polite disappointment, and she made the appropriate noises about understanding how demanding work could be. Around the room, people murmured their goodbyes, already turning back to their conversations, our departure barely a ripple in the social fabric of the afternoon. But Carrie's reaction was different. When I looked at her, ready to play my part in the coordinated exit, I saw something in her face that made my chest constrict. It wasn't surprise or disappointment. It was resignation. That flat, knowing acceptance that said she'd expected this. Expected me to leave early. Expected me to prioritize work over time with her. Expected me to choose anything other than staying present in the moment with her. She nodded once, set down her wine glass, and gathered her purse without a word. No protest, no question, no reaction at all beyond that terrible, weary acceptance. And that nod, that single gesture of resigned acknowledgement, cut through me more effectively than any argument could have. Because she'd given up expecting anything different from me. She'd stopped hoping I might stay. She'd accepted that this was who we were now, two people who performed for others but couldn't be present for each other. We made our goodbyes together, a coordinated performance we perfected over the years. Carrie hugged Valerie and promised to text her later. I shook hands and made vague plans we both knew would never materialize. And then we were walking down the front steps into the cool DC afternoon, the door closing behind us on the sound of laughter and conversation that continued perfectly well without us. The walk to the car was silent. Carrie's heels clicked against the sidewalk, a rhythmic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet street. I unlocked the doors and we both got in, the space between us and the front seat feeling vast and unbridgeable despite being only inches. I started the engine, but before pulling out, I glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, her face carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap. The burgundy dress that had looked so beautiful in Valerie's living room now seemed like a costume she couldn't wait to take off. "Carrie," I started, not knowing what I was going to say, just knowing I needed to say something. "It's fine, Joel," she said quietly, still not looking at me. "You have work. I understand." But the way she said it, flat, exhausted, without any real emotion, made it clear that understanding and accepting were two entirely different things, and that she'd been doing far too much of both for far too long. I pulled out into traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, my mind racing with everything I'd heard and everything I now understood. The business card in my desk drawer seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, a reminder of how close I'd come to destroying the only thing that had ever really mattered. How close I still might be to losing it, despite finally understanding the truth. The ride home had been silent except for the ambient noise of DC traffic and the occasional direction from the GPS that we both knew we didn't need. Carrie had gone straight upstairs when we arrived, murmuring something about needing to change. I'd heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the sound of the guest room door closing with that particular softness that was somehow worse than a slam. Now I sat in our dark living room, the only light coming from the street lamps outside filtering through the plantation shutters. My hands were trembling. Not a slight tremor but a full shake that made me grip my knees just to keep them still. The leather of the couch was cold beneath me, and I couldn't remember sitting down, though I must have at some point after Carrie disappeared upstairs. 4 years. 4 years of misinterpretation, of wounded pride masquerading as certainty, of assumptions built on assumptions until they'd calcified into what I'd believed was truth. I'd convinced myself that Carrie's withdrawal meant she'd stopped loving me, when in reality she'd been protecting herself from the pain of loving someone who seemed to have no time for her. I'd interpreted her silence as indifference when it was actually the opposite, the desperate quiet of someone afraid that speaking their truth would only confirm their worst fear. Every fight we hadn't had, every conversation we'd avoided, every night spent in separate rooms, all of it took on new meaning now. She hadn't been retreating from me. She'd been retreating from the pain of watching me disappear into work while she stood right in front of me, invisible. And I'd let her believe I preferred it that way. The business card in my desk drawer upstairs felt like it was burning through the wood, through the floor, straight down into the living room where I sat. Patricia Moretti, Esquire. I'd been carrying around the instrument of our destruction, ready to use it, convinced it was the merciful thing to do. Convinced we were already over, and I was just making it official. I looked at my watch. Nearly midnight. Carrie would be in the guest room now, probably reading or pretending to read, doing anything to avoid lying in the dark with her own thoughts. Just like she described to Valerie, choosing physical solitude over the emotional loneliness of sharing space with someone who wasn't really present. I couldn't sit here anymore. Whatever happened next, whatever came from this, I couldn't let another night pass with this knowledge sitting between us like a wall neither of us could see but both of us kept running into. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and made my way upstairs. The hallway was dark except for the thin line of light under the guest room door. I stood outside it for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, my heart doing something irregular and painful in my chest. Then I knocked. Twice. Soft enough to be respectful, firm enough that she'd hear. "Come in," Carrie's voice said, and there was a wariness in it that made me ache. I opened the door. She was sitting up in bed, wearing an old Howard University t-shirt I remembered buying her years ago. A book lay open in her lap, but her eyes were red in a way that suggested she hadn't been doing much reading. She looked at me with a careful neutrality that I now recognized as armor. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice rougher than I'd intended. She set the book aside slowly, her movements deliberate, like she was preparing herself for impact. "Okay." That word. The same one she'd said 2 months ago when I'd suggested we consider separation. But now I heard what I'd missed then, the resignation, the exhausted acceptance, the sound of someone who'd already lost hope. "I overheard you today," I said, staying in the doorway because I didn't trust myself to get closer without completely falling apart. "In Valerie's kitchen. With Valerie and Melody. I heard everything you said about us." Carrie's face did something complicated, a flash of horror, then embarrassment, then something that looked almost like relief. Her hands twisted in the bedsheet, and she looked down at them instead of at me. "Joel, she began to speak, but I cut her off. "I had a business card in my wallet," I said, needing to get it out before I lost my nerve. "A divorce attorney. Patricia Moretti. A colleague gave it to me 3 weeks ago, and I've been carrying it ever since. I was going to call her tomorrow. Monday morning. I was going to start the process of ending our marriage because I was convinced you'd already ended it in your heart." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, and I saw her face crumple before she could stop it. "What?" "I thought you didn't love me anymore," I said, and my voice cracked on the words. "I thought your coldness meant you'd checked out. I thought the separate bedrooms meant you couldn't stand being near me. I thought every silence was confirmation that we were done." "Joel," she whispered, and there were tears on her cheeks now. "But I was wrong," I continued, my own eyes burning. "I got everything wrong. You weren't indifferent. You were hurt. You weren't distant because you didn't care. You were protecting yourself because you cared too much, and I kept choosing work over you." The silence that followed was different from all the silences we'd shared over the past 4 years. This one was heavy with truth instead of avoidance, painful but necessary, like lancing a wound that had been festering too long. "I don't know what happens next," I said finally. "I don't know if we can fix this or if I've already broken too much. But I needed you to know that I heard you today. Really heard you. And I needed you to know how close I came to making the biggest mistake of my life." Guys, I'm getting really emotional right now. Tell me in the comments what you're feeling at this point. Are you rooting for Joel and Carrie? Do you think there's still hope? I want to know your vibe because what happens next changes everything between them. Carrie was crying now, not the quiet, controlled tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the kind of sobbing that came from somewhere deep and long suppressed. She pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking, and I finally crossed the threshold into the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, not quite touching her, but close enough that the space between us felt less vast than it had in years. "We didn't fail because we stopped loving each other," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "We failed because we stopped being brave enough to be honest with each other. We built walls instead of bridges. We protected ourselves instead of protecting us." She lowered her hands, her face wet and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage, when she still trusted me enough to let me see her break. "I thought I'd already lost you," she said, her voice raw. "I thought it was just a matter of time before you made it official. Every day I waited for you to say you were done." "I was going to," I admitted, and the words tasted like ash. "I was convinced that's what you wanted. That I'd be doing us both a favor by ending it cleanly." "God, Joel," she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never wanted that. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore. Every time I tried to talk about us, you had a meeting or a deadline or an emergency. And eventually I stopped trying because rejection was worse than silence." I reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. But she didn't. My hand found hers, and the contact felt both foreign and familiar, like coming home after years away. Her fingers were cold, and I wrapped them in both of my hands, trying to transfer warmth. "I don't want to call that attorney," I said, and I'd never meant anything more in my life. "I don't want a divorce. I don't want this to be over. I want to fight for us. I want to try again, really try, not just go through the motions, but actually rebuild what we had." "How?" she asked, and there was desperation in her voice. "How do we come back from 4 years of this?" "Honestly," I said. "Therapy. Real conversations. Me actually prioritizing you over work instead of just saying I will. You telling me when I'm disappearing instead of building walls. Both of us being brave enough to be vulnerable even when it's terrifying." She was quiet for a moment, studying our joined hands. "I'm scared," she said finally. "I'm scared we're too broken. That we've hurt each other too much." "I'm scared too," I admitted. "But I'd rather be scared and trying than give up without really fighting." She looked up at me then, and something in her expression shifted. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of belief that hope was possible. "What do we do first?" "You move back into our bedroom," I replied. "Not the guest room, but our room. And tomorrow I'm calling my supervisor to request reduced hours. No more late nights unless it's genuinely critical. And we find a therapist. A good one. And we commit to doing the work." "Just like that?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice. "Just like that," I said. "It won't fix everything overnight. But it's a start. It's us choosing each other instead of choosing the easy way out." She nodded slowly, and then for the first time in what felt like years, she leaned into me. Not a full embrace, but a tentative resting of her head against my shoulder, testing whether this was real or just another moment that would dissolve into disappointment. I wrapped my arm around her, and we sat there in the quiet of the guest room that would no longer be her refuge from me. "I want my husband back," she whispered against my shirt. "I want my wife back too," I said. "And I'm willing to fight like hell to find us again." The conversation with my supervisor happened on Monday morning, earlier than I'd planned but necessary in a way that felt urgent. I'd spent Sunday night lying awake next to Carrie, actually next to her in our bedroom, her breathing steady beside me, rehearsing what I needed to say. When I walked into Davidson's office at 8:30, I had the words ready. "I need to renegotiate my contract," I said, before he could even offer me coffee. Reduced hours. No more evening briefings unless it's genuinely critical. No weekend work except in actual emergencies. Davidson had leaned back in his chair, studying me with that calculating expression that made him effective at managing government consultants. That's going to mean less pay, less visibility on the major projects. I understand, I said, but my marriage is non-negotiable. I've been building someone else's legacy while destroying my own life, and I can't do that anymore. There had been a long pause, and then Davidson had nodded once. I respect that. Let's draw up the new terms. It was that simple. 4 years of killing myself for a job that would replace me within a week if I left, and all it took was one honest conversation to change the terms. I'd been so convinced the work was essential, irreplaceable, worth sacrificing everything for. But the truth was simpler and more humbling. The work would continue without me. My marriage wouldn't. Carrie had cried when I told her that evening. Not sad tears, but something else, relief maybe, or the beginning of belief that things might actually change. Dr. Jada Freeman's office was in a converted townhouse in Capitol Hill, all calm neutrals and comfortable furniture designed to make difficult conversations easier. Our first session was awkward, both of us fumbling through explanations of how we'd arrived at the edge of divorce without either of us really wanting it. But Dr. Freeman had listened with the kind of focused attention that made you feel heard, and then she'd said something that reframed everything. Relationships don't die from lack of love. They die from lack of maintenance. You've both been operating on the assumption that love should be enough on its own, but love without active cultivation is just a seed that never gets watered. She'd given us homework. Weekly check-ins where we each shared one thing we were feeling without the other person being defensive or trying to fix it. Daily phone conversations during my commute home, even if just for 10 minutes, where we talked about our actual days instead of logistics. Friday evenings protected as sacred time, no work, no phones, just us intentionally choosing to be present with each other. It sounded simple, almost too simple. But the first Friday evening we spent together, cooking dinner side by side in our kitchen, talking about nothing and everything, laughing at a story Carrie told about a disastrous client meeting, I realized how long it had been since we just existed together without performance or defense. I forgot how funny you are, I said, watching her dramatic reenactment of her boss trying to understand TikTok. She'd paused, spatula in hand, and looked at me with something soft in her expression. I forgot you noticed. We were 3 months into therapy now. 3 months of weekly sessions with Dr. Freeman, 3 months of daily phone calls and protected Friday evenings, 3 months of actively choosing each other instead of passively drifting apart. It wasn't perfect. We still had hard conversations, still stumbled over old wounds, still had moments where the defensive walls tried to rebuild themselves. But we were trying. Really trying. Not just going through the motions, but actually doing the vulnerable work of letting someone see you completely, and trusting they wouldn't use that vulnerability as a weapon. Tonight, we lay in our bed, not separate rooms, her head on my chest, my arm around her shoulders. The lamp on her nightstand cast soft light across the room we'd reclaimed together. Outside, DC traffic hummed its eternal background noise, but inside was quiet except for our breathing. I almost lost you, I said into the darkness, the words coming out without planning. We almost lost each other, Carrie corrected gently, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. But we didn't. We fought for this. I still can't believe I was going to call that attorney, I said, and the memory felt surreal now, like something that had happened to a different person. I was so convinced we were over. We were over, Carrie said. The version of us that existed 4 years ago, that was dying. But this version, the one we're building now, this is different. This is conscious. This is choice. She was right. We weren't the same couple we'd been at the beginning of our marriage, operating on the momentum of new love and assumption that passion alone would sustain us. We were something different now, more intentional, more aware, more grateful for what we had because we knew exactly how close we'd come to losing it. "I love you," I said, and the words felt different than they had in years. Not automatic or routine, but deliberate. A statement of fact and a commitment to action. "I love you too," Carrie said. "And I'm choosing you. Every day. Consciously." We lay there in the quiet, fully present with each other, both of us aware of how fragile this was and how precious. How easy it would be to slip back into old patterns if we stopped paying attention. How the work of maintaining a relationship never really ended, but was worth every moment of effort. The business card was gone now, thrown away weeks ago. But the memory of carrying it remained, a reminder of how close I'd come to making a catastrophic mistake based on assumptions and wounded pride rather than honest communication. We'd almost become another statistic. Another couple who let silence and distance erode what had once been strong. But we'd fought our way back from that edge, and in doing so, we'd built something more resilient than what we'd had before. Not perfect, but present. And that made all the difference. If you believe couples should fight for their relationships instead of giving up at the first sign of struggle, kindly hit that like button. Only people who let pride and silence destroy their marriages, people who build walls instead of bridges, would ignore a story like this. Don't let ego and poor communication win. Subscribe if you stand for real love that requires real work. And if you believe vulnerability and honest conversations can save what seems broken, comment, "I choose to fight." Don't side with the silence and assumptions that almost destroyed Joel and Carrie's marriage.